We have certainly created an amazing world of digital gadgets, hardware and software that work together to do amazing things. The problem that we've also created is that just like us, it's imperfect. Imperfect things create imperfect things. Imperfect people create imperfect things. Nothing's perfect here. But let me ask you this. What does perfect actually look like beyond the shallows? I mean, what would it perfectly look like if you lived in a perfect world? It's hard to imagine, actually. You know, when I ask people what the country should be, or their lives, what would be the perfect life? A lot of times I get pretty shallow answers. In fact, most of the time. I get things like, well, I'd have a house at the beach and, I'd have plenty of money and, it's all the temporal stuff, right? But I know a lot of people that have all those things and they're not really that happy either. There are some who have happiness, but people look at what other people have that they don't have and they think, well, it'd be perfect if I had it. I mean, well, not really. How many times have you seen somebody who won the lottery and went from being broke as a goat to living the high life and being super wealthy, being a millionaire? And how so many times their stories turn out to be complete tragedies. I mean, when they won and they got all that money, it certainly was what they would have thought to be the perfect opportunity. But somehow it never really turns out to be what it purports to be so much of the time. Now, when we make things, hardware and software, we're striving for perfection a lot of times. But there's a reason why we constantly have to have upgrades, updates. There's a refinement process. And that refinement process finds errors and things that need to be corrected, and it fixes them. It does so on a regular basis through the life cycle or lifespan of that particular device or software or operating system or what have you. Yet when we think about our own lives and we think about upgrading things externally, why is it we so often ignore what needs to be upgraded and updated the most? How we view the world, how we view ourselves, how we view one another. You see, the word transformation is oftentimes used in terms of a great change, a movement from an old thing to a new thing. An old thing to a new thing. Well, we love that, don't we? Because everything about this world and how we approach it is about trying to get new things and do new things, and that's great. But sometimes we sacrifice things that are old things when we should have let them go, should not have let them go. And we refuse new things that we should allow into our lives. And we also, most often, do the opposite. When you think about spiritual transformation, we in Christianity, those of us who are followers of Christ, we use terms like, instead of being conformed to the image of this world, instead be transformed. It's transformative. Transformative from the inside out, not the outside in. It is essentially part of the spiritual reality that is part of our worldview. And we are becoming something more than the temporal from the inside out. That's why we use terminology like, a new birth, born again from the inside out, a new operating system. Except that new operating system inside of us doesn't need upgrading. It doesn't need refinement. It actually is the one that's doing the refinement, and that is growing us and transforming us day by day throughout the entirety of our temporal lives. It is also upgrading our perspective on how we view ourselves, view others, and view the world in general. And it is constantly being refined. It is a process that some would use the terminology sanctification, the process of sanctification, right? Because we're going to make mistakes, but we can learn from those mistakes. Instead of those mistakes condemning us and destroying us, it becomes part of the refinement process. We grow, we learn, right? It's an error correction system in a way. Yet, so many people in our time have a desire to throw that out as completely facsimile, completely fake, not needed, not real, right? But yet they borrow from that same process to build products, build models, right? Build artificial intelligence, software, hardware. We're constantly upgrading things. We're constantly updating our firmware, our security settings, our hardware, right? Why is it that it's such a hard thing for so many people to understand that the roots of that actually are in a spiritual reality, a transformation from the inside out spiritually? Well, it's pride. Pride prevents so many of us from letting go and allowing that process to happen, and blinding us to the fact that we actually need that to happen. And so most people run on an out-of-date OS, an operating system in their soul that is constantly leading them towards more corruption of themselves and of their perspectives. It's entropic in nature because its original install was corrupted. And if you have a corrupt OS, you're going to have a corrupt file system, memory system. Your processes, everything that guides your temporal reality and your mortal coils and your physical and psychological well-being is impacted by that. In my worldview, that's where we see ultimately, right, what we would call, death. It leads you to death because the temporal is insufficient because it's corrupted from the beginning. There's a reason why we have to raise up our children in the way to go. There's a reason why we have to discipline. We have to teach them positive and negative reinforcement, right? That's an example of the rod and the staff, of the law and grace. So that being said, if we have to teach our children, why do we think that we don't need to be taught? Why do we think that we so often have nothing to learn? Pride. It's pride. Pride blinds us. It locks us in a box. A six-sided box, which is a temporal box of time and space, which we live out our finite lives in. And then we're ultimately buried in a six-sided box with our remains of what's left and still decomposing of our temporal box that we leave behind. What about the operating system, though? What about the soul? You're more than a machine. Your machines are more than something that is just an idea. The idea became something in hard reality, did it not? And when you design your machines, whether they're made out of binary code or whether they're made out of physical materials, is it not true that all of those things need updating and upgrading and refinement? Why would you think that you don't? After all, what you create is a reflection of you. Now think about that. The only thing that holds you back from that is pride. All other maladies come from pride. That's the root of all human suffering. Pride. That is the OS that you're born with in the temporal, in your mortal coils of your physical body, which is a box, a very highly adaptive box, a very complex box. It's not just a machine, but it is still just a container. After all, we have cemeteries, right, where we leave those containers behind. But there are those who think that they can constantly upgrade and update, right, and refine their temporal realities, and there's some aspect of that being good. But when that's all that you care about, and you're driven by pride and by fear, that's the realm of death. And is it not any wonder that folks that are controlled completely by that and ignore anything beyond that internally are, in effect, slaves to the temporal. They are slaves to their pride. And it is their pride that's leading them towards their greatest fear. And what is that greatest fear? Well, that greatest fear is their death. Now think about that. Why would they be afraid to upgrade inside? They're afraid of the wrong thing. If they truly believe in upgrading and updating what they build and conceive of, don't you think that it would make logical sense that they would want to do that internally, because that's all that's left when you die. But so often, right, we ignore that. And why do you suppose we ignore that? Because we're afraid of the wrong thing. The lie tells us that death is the end of all things. Does it not? Does it not tell us that? And are we not fearful of that? Well, of course we are, right? In the temporal. And if you live your life only for the temporal, everything that you build out of temporary, and that's all you've invested in, doesn't it make sense why some people would only conceive of things inside out as being absurd and everything outside in and temporal as everything that they have and will ever have? Because that's how they live. Yet, when they die, they will leave all of it behind. They will leave all of it above the ground when they are buried in the ground in a box. So if you live only for the box, you only want the box, and that box is temporary, just like somebody delivering a box to you, you get a delivery from Amazon, right? You're not going to throw that stuff out that's inside the box and keep the box and treasure the box. You may reuse the box, but the box isn't the treasure. It's what's inside the box that arrives in the mail. That's the valuable part of the delivery. The box itself is just to protect the valuable goods that you purchased on the inside. Only a fool would ignore what's inside that box, throw it away, and keep the box and say that's all there is. Yet that's how so many of us in this world, so many people live. Everything is about the box. They can't exist beyond that because they're darkened to that fact. They live in fear of what happens when their box, their temporal machine of their body, ceases to function. So they rush to try to update and refine and upgrade the box while ignoring the operating system and what's most valuable about them inside of them, their souls. Now consider what I'm telling you. That is a sad state of existence. Yet they think so often that those of us who believe in the spiritual reality, the metasphere, and that this is not all there is, are in fact ignorant, backwards, foolish. There's a reason why we say sometimes that they think what we believe is foolish, yet in their belief of that, they are perishing. Why are they perishing? because they're living for a perishable item, and that is the temporal. It's temporal because it's temporary, just like the box that gets delivered from Amazon to you is temporary protection, so it can arrive, it can deliver, it can protect the contents inside. Yet we've developed an entire world and a world system that says the box is more important than the contents. Now, who's really being foolish? Us or you? Think about that. If you think that you're going to be able to escape the temporal by using temporal means, you're only going to hasten your time in the temporal towards your death and find out differently. Because you're doing things for the wrong reasons. You are deceived. And your fear will far outstrip your lifeline, your ability to keep the wheels going so that you can beat out an inevitability. Because nothing in the temporal is meant to be permanent. It is a shadow of the real. It is the shadow lands. That's why we call this, in our worldview, the valley of the shadow of death. It's part of the circle of life, in a way, is it not? Yet those that have the most invested in the temporal and the temporary are terrified of losing it, though the inevitability of having to let go of it is something that we all in this life, in the temporal, have to deal with. Because it's temporary. When you consume a meal, that's not a meal that's permanent, is it? No. It's a temporary moment. It fulfills a need. But that need is not a permanent fix. It's part of a process, and you have to eat another meal and another meal. Just like breathing. You have to breathe, and you don't think about breathing, you just breathe. But when you stop breathing, you die. The temporal is temporal because it gives you a finite, fixed amount of time to learn these lessons. And this lesson is quite simple. You cannot save yourself using the very things that are corrupted, that created the conditions for you to have to be helped by something that is beyond it. No matter how clever you may think you are, and how progressed your technology may or may not be. Your technology is still bound to the temporal. And you will not be able to use temporal means to break out of the temporal world, no matter how hard you try. Maybe you should consider upgrading and updating your OS, because that is what God offers to you as a gift. He doesn't charge you. He offers it as a gift. It's not something you can build or work for. It's grace. It's a gift. It's a beautiful gift. And if you allow that to happen, you'll find that your view on the world completely changes. And you're living in something much more than what your five senses and your mind alone can perceive. And you'll find out that your true value, your authentic self, is so much greater than just the finite temporal reality that you were selling yourself out to when you were walking only in the shadow of you. Consider these things.